The dust of the valley tasted of baked earth and broken promises. Anli felt it coat her tongue, a gritty welcome to the place that was supposed to be her future. The wagon driver had left her at the base of a trail that was more a goat's memory than a road, pointing a grimy finger upward into the haze of summer heat. "He's up there," the man had grunted, not meeting her eyes. "The monster you paid for." In town they had used the same word. They had looked at her, at the faded light blue of her prairie dress, a garment handed down and worn thin, and their pity had been as sharp as stones. She was 18, had traveled an ocean and half a continent, all for a name on a piece of paper and a parcel of land promised as a dowry. A man named Owen, a man who wanted a wife who wouldn't ask questions. She had been warned. The warnings did nothing to prepare her for the man himself. He was waiting by the cabin, a structure that seemed less built and more to have grown out of the mountainside, all rough-hewn timber and stone. He was immense, not just tall but wide, a creature of muscle and raw power packed into a human frame. A wild, dark beard fell to his chest, and his hair, the same sun-bleached brown, was a tangled mane that hung past his shoulders. He didn't move as she approached, just watched her with eyes shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. His stillness was a physical weight. Anli stopped a few feet away, her small bundle of possessions feeling impossibly light in her hands. She clutched the fabric of her dress, the only thing familiar in this vast, terrifying world. He was a wall of silence. He didn't speak for 3 days. Owen moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture he had not yet decided where to place. He chopped wood with an axe that looked like a toy in his massive hands, the sound of it a sharp, percussive heartbeat in the mountain silence. He hunted, returning with game slung over a shoulder, his movements economical and silent. He ate the food she prepared without comment, his gaze fixed on his plate, his presence filling the small cabin until Anli felt she could barely breathe. She learned the landscape of his silence. There was the heavy, watchful quiet when he cleaned his rifle on the porch, his scarred knuckles moving with a practiced grace that was unsettling. There was the brooding quiet when he stared at the far ridges, his jaw tight. And there was the quiet that was simply an absence of words, a state of being so natural to him that her own thoughts felt like a trespass. Anli worked. She scrubbed the cabin floors until the wood gleamed. She tended the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the house, her small hands coaxing life from the stubborn soil. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She did not do it for him, but for herself. Work was a language she understood. It was a way to claim a piece of this world, to build a life even if it was inside a monster's den. One evening she saw him watching her as she pulled weeds, his usual guarded expression momentarily softened by the fading light. He said nothing, but the next morning a new, sturdier hoe with a freshly carved handle was leaning against the cabin wall where her old one had been. It was the first word he had spoken. The riders appeared on the 3rd week, 3 men etched against the hard blue sky on the ridge opposite the cabin. They didn't approach, just sat their horses, watching. Anli felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They were not drifters. They moved with a shared purpose, their postures radiating a patient menace. Owen came to stand beside her on the porch, his body a silent shield. He didn't reach for his rifle, but his whole being seemed to hum with a low, dangerous frequency. The men watched for an hour, a silent war of attrition across the valley, before turning their horses and disappearing back the way they had come. The air they left behind was thick with threat. "Who were they?" she asked, her voice small in the sudden quiet. He turned to look at her, his eyes unreadable. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would retreat back into his fortress of silence. "Syndicate men," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. from the Black Creek mining operation. He looked back at the empty ridge. They think this mountain has something they want. His tone was flat, but An Lee heard the deep current of something else beneath it. This was not a simple dispute over land. The way he stood, the coiled readiness in his shoulders, spoke of a history she couldn't see, a danger that had followed him here. She looked at his huge, calloused hands, hands that could split a log, or, she now realized, a man's skull. The townspeople had called him a monster. She began to wonder if they were right, but for the wrong reasons. The fear she felt was no longer of him, but for him. They came back at dusk a week later, not watchers this time, but aggressors. The attack was sudden and brutal. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the evening calm, splintering the porch rail beside An Lee's head. Owen moved with a speed that defied his size, shoving her back into the cabin with one powerful arm. "Get down," he commanded, the words a guttural bark. The quiet, withdrawn man was gone, replaced by a warrior. He moved through the darkening cabin with a fluid lethality, barring the door, shuttering the windows. Another shot punched through the wall, kicking up dust near the hearth. He didn't flinch. He grabbed his own rifle, its oiled steel dark and serious in the gloom, and moved to a side window, peering through a narrow crack in the shutter. An Lee huddled behind an overturned table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the men outside, their voices coarse and confident. They thought they were hunting a hermit. They had no idea what they had cornered. Owen fired, the report of his rifle a deafening roar inside the cabin. A scream answered from the darkness outside, sharp and final. He worked the lever, ejected the spent casing, and was still again, a predator listening to the forest. A bullet grazed the window frame, sending a shard of wood stinging into her arm. She cried out, more from shock than pain. In an instant, Owen was across the room, his massive form eclipsing the faint moonlight. His eyes found the small trickle of blood on her sleeve, and a look of such concentrated fury crossed his face that it stole her breath. He was no longer just defending his home. He was defending her. He drove them off with a controlled, terrifying violence. 2 more shots from the cabin, 2 more pained cries from the yard, and then the sound of horses retreating in a panic. Silence fell, deeper and more profound than before, broken only by the chirping of crickets that seemed unaware of the human carnage that had just unfolded. The smell of gunpowder was sharp in the air. Owen lit a lantern, the yellow light throwing his face into stark relief, all harsh angles and shadow. He came to her, his movements careful now, the warrior receding. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. He knelt, his bulk making the floorboards groan, and gently took her arm. His fingers, which could wield an axe with such force, were surprisingly gentle as they pushed back her sleeve to examine the shallow gash. It was nothing, a scratch, but the sight of her blood on his thumb seemed to shake him to his core. He cleaned the wound with water and a strip of clean cloth, his focus absolute. The domesticity of the act was a stark contrast to the violence that had just occurred. "They're not here for the land," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He wasn't looking at her, but at the dark wound on her skin. "Not really. The syndicate wants this mountain, but they want me more." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the armor was gone. In his eyes, she saw not a monster, but a man who was profoundly tired of running. "I was a witness, federal. I testified against their owner, a man named Prendergast, for bribery, for murder. They put him away, and his men have been hunting me ever since." The siege began 2 nights later. This time they brought more men, a dozen at least, and they meant to finish it. They surrounded the cabin, their lanterns pinpricks of malevolent light in the oppressive darkness. The first volley of shots was a declaration of war, ripping through the wooden walls, shattering the last of the window panes. An Lee and Owen worked together in the flickering lantern light, a silent, efficient team. She reloaded the spare rifle as he fired, her hands moving quickly, her earlier fear replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He would fire, work the action, and hand her the warm weapon, taking the freshly loaded one from her without a word. Their movements became a rhythm, a deadly dance against the chaos outside. "West window," he would grunt, and move to a new position. "3, by the woodpile." She would follow, staying low, her body aching with a tension she had never known. Hours bled together. The syndicate men were relentless, pushing closer, using the rocks and trees for cover. The cabin, once a shelter, was becoming a tomb. They were trapped. A Molotov cocktail, a bottle filled with oil and a burning rag, crashed against the side of the house, and flames began to lick up the dry timber. Panic seized on Lee for a moment, hot and suffocating. Owen was already moving, grabbing a heavy blanket from his cot. "The water barrel!" he yelled over the crackle of the fire. Together they smothered the flames, beating them back with the sodden blanket, the smoke stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. They were exposed, silhouetted against the fire, and the gunfire from outside intensified, chewing up the ground around them. The fire was out, but the attack was now desperate, frenzied. A heavy log, used as a battering ram, slammed against the front door, the wood groaning in protest. Another slam, and the bar holding it splintered. Owen shoved a heavy chest of drawers in front of it, but he knew it wouldn't hold. "The back," he said, his voice ragged. "Go!" But there was nowhere to go. Just as he spoke, a man burst through the shattered remains of a window, a wild look in his eyes and a pistol in his hand. He was on Lee before she could react, grabbing the front of her dress. Owen roared, a sound of pure primal fury, and launched himself across the room. He didn't use his rifle. He hit the man with his body, a collision of bone and muscle that sent them both crashing into the far wall. The intruder's pistol went off, the flash a blinding white star in the dark room. Owen cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered back, clutching his side. Blood, dark and slick, bloomed between his fingers. The man on the floor scrambled for his weapon, but Lee was already moving. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her mind utterly clear. She swung it with all her strength, a desperate, protective rage fueling the blow. The sound it made was sickeningly final. The man collapsed and didn't move. She dropped the poker, her hands shaking, and rushed to Owen's side as he slid to the floor, his back against the wall. The fight outside seemed to fade away, the entire world narrowing to the space between them, to the blood soaking through his shirt. The dawn came slowly, filtering through the smoke-filled cabin in pale, dusty shafts. It revealed a scene of utter devastation. The yard was littered with still forms. The survivors of the syndicate's force had fled with the first light, leaving their dead behind. Inside, the cabin was a wreck of shattered furniture and splintered wood. But they were alive. Lee had spent the night tending to Owen, her fear a constant metallic taste in her mouth. The bullet had gone clean through the flesh of his side, a painful, dangerous wound, but one he would survive if she could keep the fever away. She had cleaned it as best she could, using whiskey to sterilize the needle and thread from her sewing kit to stitch the ragged edges of skin together. He had been conscious through most of it, his breath hissing through his teeth, his hand gripping hers with a strength that belied his injury. Now he slept, his breathing shallow but steady. His head rested in her lap, his long, matted hair fanned out across her blue dress. She gently brushed a strand from his face, his skin hot to the touch. The monster. That's what they had called him. Looking at him now, at the vulnerability in the lines of his face, softened by sleep and pain, she saw only the man. A man who had put his body between her and a bullet. A man who had carried a terrible burden alone for years. The silence that settled over the cabin was different from any that had come before. It was not empty or tense. It was a shared space, earned through blood and terror, and it was filled with the unspoken truth of what they had just become to each other. Weeks passed. The rhythm of their lives slowly reestablished itself, but the foundation beneath it had irrevocably shifted. An-Lee hunted now, using the spare rifle. She had watched him enough to know how, her movements precise, her aim steady. She brought back rabbit and grouse, preparing broths and stews to help him regain his strength. Owen healed slowly. He spent his days on his cot or sitting on the porch, his rifle always within reach, watching the ridges. But the vigilance in his eyes was different. He was no longer just watching for threats. He was watching her. He watched her move through the garden, her worn blue dress a spot of soft color against the green. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough for bread, their smallness belying their strength. The silence between them returned, but it was a comfortable wait now, a language of shared experience. One afternoon, she returned from checking her snares to find him standing, leaning heavily against the porch rail, but standing nonetheless. He had taken the bucket to the well and drawn fresh water for her. It was a simple chore, but the effort had left him pale and sweating. "You shouldn't have," she said, her voice soft. "It's my turn," he replied, his voice still rough. He looked at her, and for the first time, a small, weary smile touched the corners of his mouth, a crack in the stoic facade. In that simple gesture, she saw the future she had thought was lost. It wasn't the life she had been promised on a piece of paper, but something harder, truer, and built from the ashes of a violent night. It was a life forged, not given. He was almost fully healed when the federal marshals finally arrived, drawn by reports from the town of the failed assault on the mountain cabin. They took statements, carted away the bodies, and confirmed that with the syndicate's forces broken and their leaders implicated, Owen's ordeal was finally over. The law had caught up to his past, and for the first time in years, he was a free man. After they left, a profound quiet descended on the mountain. The threat that had defined Owen's existence was gone, leaving a vacuum in its place. That evening, they sat on the repaired porch, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet. The air was cool and clean. For the first time, An-Lee saw Owen look at the horizon not with vigilance, but with something like peace. He turned to her, his large frame silhouetted against the dying light. "You could go," he said, his voice quiet, matter of fact. "You're not bound to this. Not to me." An-Lee looked at the cabin, its walls scarred with bullet holes, a testament to what they had endured together. She looked at the small, thriving garden she had nurtured. Then she looked at him, at this huge, quiet man who had shielded her with his own body. He was not a monster. He was her home. "Where would I go?" she asked softly. He had no answer. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning. She leaned into it, a silent surrender. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a deeper, more profound connection. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of a promise made in the crucible of violence and sealed in the quiet of its aftermath. "You're not a stranger," he murmured against her mouth. "Not anymore." And in the vast, wild silence of the mountain, she knew she had finally found the truth.